Jackson was also seen as, in general, supporting the power of the states over the power of the national government, although this was not always the case, particularly during the first great crisis of Jackson's presidency, which did deal with the tariff. Very late in John Quincy Adams' presidency, Jackson's supporters had actually proposed a very high tariff in 1828, which would often be known as the Tariff of Abominations. It would turn out to be one of the highest tariffs in American history. Um, they had created it, even though they hated high tariffs, in the hopes that President Adams would have to veto it, thus undermining his own support for high tariffs. Or he would accept it, creating a tariff so high that everyone would hate him for signing off on it, which is what ended up happening. So everyone was stuck with a tariff that nobody liked. And during Jackson's presidency, many people opposed it, but the most significant of these were the people of South Carolina, or at least some of their leaders, certainly not all. But ultimately, they declared in 1832 that they would nullify the tariff, refuse to enforce it within their own borders, and assumed Jackson would support them in this. As his own vice president, John C. Calhoun, kind of encouraged him to do. But Jackson shot that down. And for the rest of his career, truly hated John C. Calhoun, as he hated Henry Clay. Suppose he's saying on his deathbed that his only regret was he had never hanged John C. Calhoun or shot Henry Clay. Because when South Carolina threatened to nullify the tariff, creating the nullification crisis, Jackson threatened to march into South Carolina and got congressional approval to do so, threatening to hang all the nullifiers, including John C. Calhoun if necessary. And South Carolina backed down. Henry Clay also worked at a lower compromise tariff in 1833, the second of the Great Compromiser's three compromises, the first having been the Missouri Compromise in 1820. Jackson also came to have a new opponent in the Bank of the United States, which again he viewed as undemocratic, seeing that.
Hey, Dad.
Again, the Bank of the United States was seen by Jackson, many people, especially Westerners, as supporting the interests of the elite of the East Coast, with most of the stock, aside from the 1/5 held by the U.S. government, in the hands of a few wealthy investors. Furthermore, because of Jackson's known opposition to the bank, um, it was made an issue in the election of 1832. Henry Clay having Congress vote to re-charter the bank, even though that was not necessary for 4 more years. Jackson vetoed the bank charter, as he had vetoed the attempt to create a national road called the Maysville Road, which would have linked the East and the West. Jackson's veto of the bank recharter was the beginning of what was known as the Bank War, as Jackson tried to destroy the bank over the course of his second term, began withdrawing federal funds from the bank, effectively bankrupting it, even before its charter actually ran out. But during the election, the bank actively campaigned against Jackson, lending and donating money to his opponents. But Jackson was reelected anyway, defeating the National Republicans and also the Anti-Masonic Party, formed by people who wanted to promote moral reform, temperance, banning the carrying of mail on Sundays, and opposing the Masons, who were seen as an aristocratic secret society. And in Jackson's second term, his opponents began to coalesce as a new party, the Whig Party, led by Henry Clay and Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster. And many of them supported Clay's American system, higher tariffs, internal improvements, a Bank of the United States, and by the standards of the day, a big government, but one controlled by Congress, not the president. And so they called themselves the Whig Party, after the old British Party, or the still extant British Party at the time, who also supported a weaker monarch and a more powerful parliament. But there were also Whigs who joined not because they supported the American system, but actually who supported states' rights and a more limited government overall, but who felt that Jackson was making himself into a tyrant, King Andrew I, and a king whom they wished to limit. So that the Whigs were a fairly diverse party, who absorbed the anti-Masons, by the way. So predominantly, they had Eastern business interests, but they also had Western interests who wanted roads to link the East and the West. They mostly supported a relatively powerful central government, but there was a states' rights faction. And so they were a national party, North and South, East and West. And likewise the Democrats, as Jackson's followers came to be known outright, or simply calling themselves, in many cases, the Democracy, were a national party too, North and South, East and West, tending to be farmers rather than urban types, agricultural rather than commercial, but there were certainly exceptions on both sides. So that in the second two-party system, we had national level parties where different regions could work together and try to sort things out in the face of growing divisions over slavery in particular, but divisions that were mostly worked through for now. During the second two-party system, the Democrats tended to dominate the presidency, although often being elected with pretty narrow margins. The Whigs only actually electing two presidents, both of whom died in office, and both of them being elected on the basis of them being war heroes, William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, and each of them was a vice presidential candidate who represented kind of a minority faction of the Whigs, and who, once president, turned out to in many ways be an ineffective president, John Tyler and Millard Fillmore. So in the second two-party system would see some clear divisions, in the Whigs favoring internal improvements, the Jacksonians opposing them at the national level, the Whigs wanting a high tariff, the Democrats a low tariff, the Whigs favoring the bank and the Democrats opposing it. The Democrats in general welcomed immigration, as most immigrants did tend to become poorer farmers, or in the case of Irish immigrants, poorer urban workers who tended to vote Democratic. The Whigs were more suspicious of immigration, again because many immigrants tended to vote Democratic. Also, the Whigs did have a strong Protestant Christian element, who were suspicious of the Catholics, who made up a large part of the immigrant population, particularly among the Irish, but also the Germans, who began to come after the failed revolutions of 1848. Whereas many disagreed with Catholicism on theological grounds, there was also the fear that Catholics could not be good citizens of a democracy because their first loyalty would be not to the United States, but to the Pope in Rome. It is, after all, hard to say no to the personal representative of Jesus Christ on earth. And to be fair, the Catholic Church was officially opposed to democracy at the time, viewing it as a threat to the supremacy of the Church. And the French Revolution certainly had attacked the Catholic Church, seizing its property and executing many of its leaders, giving them some reason to be suspicious of it. But still, the parties were national level parties found across the country and managing to work through differences, in particularly over slavery for the most part. The Missouri Compromise, having been created by Henry Clay, had kept slave and free states balanced in the Senate from 1820 up till 1850, when after the gold rush, California had enough citizens to want to become a state, but a free state, despite half the state being south of the old Missouri Compromise line. Some were opposed to slavery in and of itself. Many were miners who did not want to have to compete with slave labor. There were both moral and economic reasons for them to oppose slavery. This would have unbalanced the Senate and was seen as a real threat to the South, who was already well outnumbered in the House of Representatives, but did have a lot of influence in the presidency, the Supreme Court, and again, equal say in the Senate. The Compromise of 1850, worked out by Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, and the up-and-coming Democratic senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, allowed California to become a free state, banned the slave trade, although not slavery, in Washington, D.C., and guaranteed that some land claimed by Texas would actually be U.S. government territory to be distributed or sold as it saw fit. To make things up to the South, a stronger fugitive slave law was created. But it was often not followed in the North, many Northerners being unhappy with having to essentially work as slave catchers for the South. And while there had been slave owners and opponents of slavery and people who were indifferent in both the Democratic and the Whig Party, the Democrats managed to mostly work through that for now, but the Whigs increasingly split as conscience Whigs who could not compromise over slavery began to break away from the Whig Party, as did a Free Soil Party, actually led in part by Martin Van Buren, who accepted slavery where it existed, but wanted to ban its further spread west. And also a Know-Nothing Party, very actively opposed to immigration, split away mostly from the Whigs, although some from the Democrats too. In 1852, the Whigs nominated for the presidency the war hero Winfield Scott, conqueror of Mexico City, one of the greatest military minds of his age, as the Duke of Wellington, the man who beat Napoleon himself, proclaimed. But Scott lost. He personally didn't like slavery, and so Southern Whigs didn't trust him. But he accepted its constitutionality, so conscience Whigs did not want to support him either, and he lost to the relatively uninspiring but young and handsome Franklin Pierce, despite him being widely rumored to be a drunk, most famous for falling off his horse in Mexico, either because he was drunk or because a cannonball landed close to it and frightened the animal on the rough ground of the Pedregal, south of Mexico City. And with Scott's defeat, the Whig Party essentially collapsed in 1852, bringing an end, a very clear end, to the second two-party system. The Democrats would try to hold things together, but would struggle to do so, and there would no longer be an opposition party that represented all parts of the country. As during the 1850s, Northern Whigs, Free Soilers, Know-Nothings, and some Democrats opposed to slavery would coalesce in 1854 into a new party, a radical party supporting civil rights and big government spending, the Republican Party. And so a third two-party system would start to develop, really coalescing during and after the Civil War. A war sometimes blamed on the collapse of the second two-party system, when there were no longer two nationwide parties, with a real interest in compromising and working together and holding the country together. So 1852 is a pretty clear end to the second two-party system. Besides the last major political defeat for the Whigs, it was also in that year that the great compromiser, Henry Clay, and the great public speaker, the godlike Daniel Webster, two of the great politicians of their age, both died. The other leading figure of the age, John C. Calhoun, having died 2 years before, after having the junior senator from South Carolina read his final speech to the Senate, criticizing the Compromise of 1850. The 1850s would then see a time of political and social chaos that we will discuss shortly.